Welcome to Knowledge 12, Fighting for a Cause. We're on our second lesson where we're going to start learning about different people who are fighting for a cause. Today we're going to be learning about Susan B. Anthony and an advocate for women's rights. Before we get started on learning about her, let's go over our vocab words. We have one word. I will read the word. You repeat it after me. Courage. What do you think courage means? Yeah, courage means having bravery when facing a dangerous situation. So listen today to how Susan B. Anthony had courage, and listen as we go through all seven of our people we're going to learn about how they all had to have courage. Again, today you're going to be able, after today's read aloud, you're going to be able to explain who Susan B. Anthony was. Also, you're going to be able to explain the connections between Susan B. Anthony and women's rights. And lastly, you're going to be able to show an understanding of the word ballots. Susan B. Anthony was born a very long time ago in Massachusetts in the year 1820. When she was a little girl, she did not know what she would grow up to become. Or when she was a little girl, she did not know that she would grow up to become so influential. But that was to be her destiny. Her family certainly helped to shape the person she was to become. Susan's family was different from many other families. They were Quakers. Quakers are members of a religious group called, called the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers believe that all people should be equal. Susan's family did not judge people based on color or whether they were male or female. In their eyes, everyone was equal. But a long time ago, when Susan was a young girl, not everyone thought that way. For one thing, many people thought that it was more important for boys to be educated than it was for girls or people of color. How would you have felt about that? How would you feel if only boys were able to go to school and girls would not, could not? Susan was lucky because her parents did not agree with this view. They wanted their daughter to receive a good education. When Susan was 6 years old, she went to school. One day, a teacher at the school refused to teach Susan a difficult math problem because she was a girl. As a result, her parents decided that Susan should be educated at home. Later, Susan attended a Quaker boarding school near Philadelphia. So a boarding school is a school where students live at the school rather than go home every day. When her parents struggled to pay the fees, however, she left school and finished her education at home. Later, Susan became a teacher. Susan eventually became a head mistress or kind of like a principal of the school. Susan worked hard to help her family financially. Susan quickly discovered, though, that female teachers earned less money than male teachers for doing the very same job. When Susan was 29 years old, she left the world of education and settled in her family home. Susan's family was now living near Rochester in New York. It was during this time that she met some very brave people who were trying to abolish or end slavery in the United States. These people are called abolitionists. Secret meetings were held late at night in her family home. Susan became involved too. Her heart began to tell her that it was important that she try to make the world a fairer place. So Susan decided that she would join the fight to abolish slavery. A long and difficult journey had begun. In the early days of the Civil War, Susan helped to organize women's groups to speak out about slavery. This was not an easy thing to do. Back then, people did not have computers or cell phones. Susan and her supporters had to travel in horse-drawn carriages and communicate by letter. Newspapers printed many articles that criticized her views and called her a troublemaker. Susan did not care. She was fearless. What do you think the word fearless means? Well, fear means being scared of something. Fearless, when we have that suffix less, it means not scared, not full scared. While the Civil War raged in January 1863, President Abraham Lincoln took an important step towards ending slavery when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation or statement announced that the government intended to free all slaves in the United States. This meant that former slaves could make decisions about their own lives and they could receive money for the work they did. In December 1865, after the Civil War, slavery was abolished or ended completely. In the next few years after the Civil War, the law was changed so that former slaves became citizens and male slaves were given the right to vote. Susan was very happy that former male slaves had gained these rights. She was extremely unhappy that women did not have the same rights. The next fight was about to begin. It might be difficult to believe now, but when Susan was alive, women had very few rights. As you have discovered, back then many people did not think it was important to educate girls. Women had very limited roles or small jobs in their communities. They could attend meetings, but were not allowed to speak in public, hold office, or vote. Women were not allowed to become doctors or lawyers. Few girls stayed in the school beyond the eighth grade. Married women could not own property. If they did own property before they got married, they had to turn it over to their husbands after they got married. Susan had hoped that former abolitionists would now support women's rights. She was disappointed to discover that many men who had helped to abolish slavery did not believe that women should have suffrage, or that word suffrage means the right to vote. Susan was determined to change this view. Susan joined forces with two women named Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Together, they began to fight for women's rights. Women like Susan, who campaigned against these laws, became known as suffragettes, or people who fought for women's suffrage. What does that word suffrage mean again? Susan became secretary of the American Equal Rights Association. She traveled all over the country by wagon, carriage, and train, speaking for women's suffrage. She organized petitions and clubs, and she wrote newspaper articles. Susan also became a publisher of the Revolution, a newspaper dedicated to women's issues. Printed on the front page of this newspaper were the words, "Men, their rights are their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." Why would Susan B. Anthony use a newspaper to help fight for a cause or speak for herself? Well, it was the best way to communicate back in the day. They didn't have news stations or other ways to communicate, and a lot of people would be reading the paper. So that's a different way to fight for a cause, and she was using it as a way to speak her mind. Susan invested her own money in the newspaper, continuing to fight for women's rights. Susan also helped to found or start the National Suffrage Association. When Susan ran out of money, she gave up her position at the newspaper and had to find another way to make money. She began to tour the country speaking to groups that paid to hear her speak. Susan was in her 50s when she took her campaign one step further. She tried to cast her vote for president. She and several other women marched into a New York barbershop where male voters were voting. The women held a protest. They demanded the right to vote. The men in charge were unsure of what to do. They were unable to stop the women. So, the women finally voted in the election. And so, in 1872, about 50 years before it was legal to do so, Susan and other women cast their ballots for the President of the United States. You can see in her hand she's casting that ballot, or it's that piece of paper used to cast votes. 2 weeks later, Susan was arrested and charged with illegal voting. Her arrest caused a national uproar. Susan was not afraid. She asked the general public to consider, is it a crime for a United States citizen to vote? The judge in the trial did not think women should have the right to vote. He decided against Susan before the trial even started. He did not let her talk. He ordered the jury to find her guilty. He then asked Susan if she had anything to say. I have many things to say. In order For in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural right, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. The judge tried to quiet Susan, but she continued to speak. He sentenced her to pay a fine of $100. Susan's response was to say, I shall never pay a dollar of your unjust penalty. And she never did. What a tough woman. By the end of the 19th century, people's views about Susan B. Anthony began to change. She had become a national heroine. A heroine is a female hero. Boys are heroes and girls are heroines. Susan continued to travel the country, speaking for women's voting rights. Now, people couldn't wait to hear her speak. She became the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, a job she held until the age of 80 when she retired. 6 years later, on March 13, 1906, Susan B. Anthony died in Rochester, New York. She had worked for more than 50 years, a half a century, for women's rights. Although she did not live to see women get the right to vote when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1920, she had helped to make it happen. Susan B. Anthony was quite an amazing woman. She was prepared to stand up and fight for what she believed was right. Do you think you would have had enough courage to do the same? So what are the connections between Susan B. Anthony and women's rights? Yeah, so Susan B. Anthony, she fought for women's rights. Specifically, one of the most important ones, she fought for women's rights to vote. Our word work word for today was the word ballots. I will read the word, you repeat it after me. Ballots. So ballots are slips of paper used to cast or keep track of votes. John found 2 extra ballots lying on the floor, which changed the final number of votes. So I'm going to read a sentence and you're going to respond. Would your ballot say yes to this, or would your ballot say no? And if you're listening with somebody else, it's okay to have different opinions on it. That's what voting's all about. You get to state your opinion. Teachers should give homework every night. Well, actually, as a teacher, I would say my ballot would say no, because I would want you guys to rest up every once in a while. Our class should take a field trip to the zoo. My ballot would say yes. I would love to see different zoo animals. Children should go to school on Saturdays and Sundays. Okay, if any of you said ballot yes, you're crazy. We need the weekend to rest. Teachers should never give tests. My ballot would say no. Tests are good to show me what you've learned. Our class should have cookies and milk every day. Well, as long as the teacher gets some, yes. So again, when we look at this timeline, remember a timeline, when we look at the left of the timeline, that means it's farther in the past. And as we go to the right, that means we're heading farther in the future. And on our timeline, we have a picture of Susan B. Anthony. And connected with Susan B. Anthony was also Abraham Lincoln, because remember, one thing she fought for was abolishing slavery. And you're going to hear about Abraham Lincoln a little bit later on when we talk about the Civil War. But we connect Susan B. Anthony with Abraham Lincoln because they're right around the same time in the timeline. Again, we're going to keep hearing about some extraordinary people as we move ahead in our read aloud. Our next read aloud, we're going to hear about Eleanor Roosevelt and her fight for human rights.